Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today we're continuing the 2018 year-end list with my top 10 worst songs of 2018. This list is just entirely my own personal opinion. If you happen to disagree and you happen to like any of these songs, or if you happen to think that there's other songs that aren't on this list that are worse, that's perfectly fine. This is just 10 songs that I happen to hear from 2018 that I found to be the least enjoyable overall. Aside from that, the songs on this list had to have been released in 2018, as in January 1st, 2018, December 31st, 2018. Also, the songs on this list didn't have to be singles, they didn't have to chart necessarily, they just had to be any type of song. So this means a really popular track that charted and was a single could be on this list, or it could also mean an obscure deep cut that no one has really heard of could also make this list as well. Also, one last rule for this list. I have a one song per album rule on this list here today, just because if not, certain albums would have lots of songs from them on this list possibly, and that wouldn't be a lot of fun to talk about. So yeah, I'm implementing that rule for that reason. And with that out of the way, let's get into the number 10 pick here on my list, which is the track Propaganda by Muse. This track comes off the band's most recent album, Simulation Theory, that came out earlier this year, and overall I didn't really care all too much for the album as a whole, but most of the tracks on it were bad in a kind of boring, uninteresting way. However, Propaganda stands out as being a track that has a lot more bad things to it than just being boring and uninteresting, though those aspects are certainly present here on this song. The aspect of this track that was made fun of the most and criticized the most when this track was initially released is the hook on this track, which is just the phrase propaganda being repeated over and over again with this mechanical, robot-like voice effect over it, and it doesn't sound very good. I believe the adjective I used in my review of the album was like a farty sound, like it sounds like a fart almost. It's just not very pleasant to listen to. It's really silly as well. Maybe something like this could work in a more ridiculous song, but this track is trying to be pretty serious overall, and it just doesn't work very nicely. Outside of that pretty sorry excuse for a hook, the verses here on this track aren't particularly interesting either. The instrumental has this very spacey, moody, trap-inspired sound to it that isn't particularly interesting to me, and the lyrics aren't anything all too standout either. There's kind of this very generic, bland type of political lyric where they try to deliver a message, but they don't really say anything all too specific or interesting. It's just very bare bones. And then there's this really awkward bridge in the track, which features some more natural sounding instrumentation that is kind of used together with some of the more electronic instrumentation that have been present in the track up to this point. And it just sounds really awkward having some of this more acoustic instrumentation paired up with these trap hi-hats. It's just a really awkward combo, and maybe something like that could work in theory, but Muse don't really pull it off here on this song. This track is really just a pretty big mess at the end of the day. There's a lot going on here, but none of it really works all that much. They definitely take some risks and experiment here on this track, but it doesn't end up working for them at the end of the day. A lot of this track sounds either boring or laughable, and neither of those things are a good thing. Next up on my list, I actually have a cover song. It is a cover of the 311 track Down by The Offspring. Now, earlier this year, these two bands decided to cover one of each other's tracks. 311 covering the Offspring song Self-Esteem, and The Offspring, as I just said, covering the 311 track Down. Both of these covers are pretty terrible, all things considered. However, the 311 cover was very close to making it onto this list, but didn't quite make it. But it still is pretty terrible at the end of the day. However, I just felt like the cover of Down was the worst of the two. Now, I wouldn't really consider myself much of a fan of 311. I could definitely respect the sound they have going for them. However, it's just not really for me at the end of the day, I guess you could say. However, I do think the original track is decent, and it definitely does a pretty fair job of pulling that 90s alternative rock sound while pulling in a whole bunch of different genre influences. It definitely sounds like something straight out of the 90s. And that might be what kind of led this cover to be as terrible as it is, because on this cover here, The Offspring try to pull from these very same influences that the original track tries to pull from, but they also try to keep their own pop-punk sound at the same time, and it just ends up sounding like a mess at the end of the day. The verses on this cover go for the more pop-punk sound, and it's all pretty alright, I guess you could say. From here, it's not particularly interesting. However, when the chorus comes in on this track, that's really where things start to get pretty terrible, as the chorus here just sounds really awful. It sounds like they're trying to play pop-punk meets reggae-infused rock meets funk-infused rock and hip-hop, all these different sounds, and it just sounds like a mess, really. And it doesn't really help that the vocals here on the chorus have been manipulated and covered in auto-tune to the point of just sounding very unpleasant on the ear. The chorus of the track just sounds so much more overproduced than the rest of the song, and it's really jarring transitioning from any other part of the track into the chorus. It just feels like I'm listening to two different songs being mashed together, which isn't a very good thing considering that this is a cover of a song that in its original format doesn't sound that way. As I said, I may not be the biggest 311 fan out there by any means. However, I'd much rather listen to the original track over this Offspring cover that came out earlier this year. The original at least has an identity of its own and very unique qualities to it. This cover here just sounds like a mess. Moving on to my number 8 pick here on the list, I have Champagne by Five Finger Death Punch. Not as in like the drink champagne, as in like champagne. This track is Five Finger Death Punch's attempt, or one of their attempts from their most recent album, to address a lot of the drama and controversy, I guess, surrounding the group following their last album. And it doesn't really end up being a good addressing of this drama, I guess you could say. In fact, I feel like Five Finger Death Punch walk away from this track looking worse than they do coming into it. On this track, they try to go after publications and critics and all these people who have kind of, I guess, gone after them before their label as well. And they just come off really immature on this track because they don't really bring any, counterpoints to a lot of the criticisms they've received in the past before, anything quite like that. They don't make a very convincing argument here on this song. Their idea of making a good argument is to just act like a tough guy, swear a lot, and act really immature. And that's why I feel like they end up walking away from this track looking worse than they do coming into it. It also doesn't really help that the band just sounds really bored here on this song. I mean, you'd expect something like this to be a very aggressive track, of course, a very passionate song as well. However, they don't really bring that passion here on this song. There definitely is some kind of anger here, but it just feels very phoned in, really. The verses go for that kind of tough guy, half-talking, half-rapping delivery that Five Finger Death Punch have used before. And it doesn't sound very convincing, really. It just kind of sounds like the lead singer is constipated. And when it gets to the chorus of the track, they just sound so bored, really. They don't sound very passionate. They don't sound angry. At most, they sound mildly annoyed. The instrumental on this track isn't anything all too great either, mostly being your typical generic radio rock and metal chugging with a pretty generic guitar solo thrown in there as well. At the end of the day, this track just isn't very good to me. The lyrics are pretty trash, the instrumental is pretty boring, the band just has no passion in their delivery of this song, even though it should be a pretty passionate topic for them. Yeah, just avoid this one if you haven't heard it already. Next up, we have a new track from the 1975's latest album. The track's called Two Time, Two Time, Two Time. And this track is one of the biggest examples of one of the biggest problems I had with that last 1975 record. That being that oftentimes on the album, the band tried to experiment with different genres, but they'd oftentimes just take the most surface level aspects of those genres and not really incorporate it into their own sound in a very natural sounding way. And Two Time, Two Time, Two Time is a prime example of that. On this song in particular, the band attempts to pull from this tropical sounding, almost dance hall-like style of music. And I'll admit I'm not a particularly knowledgeable person when it comes to that style of music, but even I feel like, with my limited knowledge of this genre, that the band is just pulling the most surface level aspects of it into their own music here, and they don't really attempt to mix it into their own style all that nicely. It just kind of feels like they're playing musical dress-up, as I've said in my initial review of this album and song. And outside of this very surface level experimentation, a lot of the rest of what the track has going for it isn't super interesting. The instrumental is pretty uneventful. The delivery isn't particularly interesting either. The lyrics attempt to talk about relationships, tie them back to some of the album's greater themes of relationships, the internet, technology, and all that stuff. But it doesn't really do a good job of bringing anything new to the table. Like much of the rest of the album that this track is from, it doesn't really say anything all too new or exciting about relationships and technology and how they connect together. It just says a bunch of stuff that you probably already know being a human being living in the year 2018. So yeah, very little in the way of lyrical substance here on this track, a pretty boring instrumental and delivery of the lyrics themselves. Also some pretty surface level experimentation here that just pulls from the most surface level aspects of a particular genre that the band's probably never going to experiment with again. It just makes for a pretty uneventful track at the end of the day. That's also pretty frustrating with how little it does with the genre that it's pulling from. Next up on my list, I have Machine by Imagine Dragons. Now, I didn't like any of the tracks from Imagine Dragons' newest album by any means, and for a good period of time, I was thinking about which track from the album I found to be the worst, and at the end of the day, I decided to go with Machine for this list, because it's really amazing how many aspects about Imagine Dragons that I don't really care for end up making their way into this one song. If I wanted to explain to someone why I dislike Imagine Dragons' recent output, I could do so with only using this one song as an example, really, because it really just has that much in it that I don't enjoy. The vocals here on this track are very overdramatic and overblown, like they're just really trying hard to sell you the lyrics here on the song, like they're the most important thing you need to hear. However, when you actually look into the lyrics, they're not all too deep or interesting. In fact, they're pretty shallow at the end of the day. I honestly feel like the vocals would do a lot better, maybe paired up with a more natural, aggressive sounding piece of instrumentation. However, instead it's paired up with this very overproduced piece of modern pop that's also very clunky and very stiff. It just doesn't work very nicely with the very overdramatic, over-the-top style of vocal delivery that Imagine Dragons have going for them. Not to mention, as I said before, the lyrics on this track aren't particularly interesting or exciting. They're just your typical, uninteresting pop rock lyrics that aren't gonna interest anyone. They're just kind of there to be there. But when you actually look at them a bit more, it can get to be a little bit funny if you're someone like me who's been critical of this band in recent years. Because one of the biggest criticisms thrown at this group in recent years is that they are kind of sellouts in a sense. And on this track, they're singing about not being part of a machine. And, you know, it's kind of funny given that the band is probably one of the biggest factors in the modern pop rock machine, if you will. And I'm not sure if this track is attempting to talk about this criticism, to, you know, respond to it or anything along those lines. But if it is an attempt at responding to that, they didn't do a very good job of it. And if it wasn't an attempt to respond to that, the band needs to be a bit, you know, smarter about what they decide to write and sing about on their tracks, because something like this just ends up being a bit funny to me, because, yeah, Imagine Dragons, you are part of a machine, for sure. Next up on the list, I have the track One Track Mind from 30 Seconds to Mars, featuring A$AP Rocky. This track is easily one of the most boring songs I've heard all year. There's so little to this track worth caring about. The instrumental is this very hazy, very spacey, modern-sounding piece of pop that has this trap influence going for it as well. It's kind of like the instrumental to Muse's Propaganda I was talking about before, but even less interesting. The vocals here on this track are very boring as well. They just don't sound like they care at all. Like, compared to this track, Five Finger Death Punch on Champagne, they sounded incredibly passionate on that track compared to this thing. Because here, it sounds like they're not even trying with the vocals. It sounds like they're half asleep recording the vocals here for this track. Even when they're trying to be more emotional here at some moments on the song, it doesn't sound emotional. It just sounds like they're phoning in whatever type of emotional delivery they were going for. And then A$AP Rocky's feature on this track is abysmal as well, which is, you know, kind of unfortunate considering I was hoping that if any part of this track would be okay, it would be his feature. You know, maybe he could add something to this track that would be interesting, or at least something that sounded different from what the rest of the track had going for it up to this point. But unfortunately, his verse on this track is just straight up garbage and sounds really phoned in. He's got some of the worst lyrics on the entire track. For example, love is like problems, we all got them. You know, something incredibly generic and filler like that. Or even worse, probably some of the worst lyrics I've heard this year, to be honest. Hurts only 30 seconds to Mars, and it took you even less just to get to my heart. Like, that's how he ends his verse here on this track. And with those lyrics alone, with him delivering those lyrics in a completely serious manner, this track alone was guaranteed a spot on this list just for those lyrics. There's really not much else to say about it. Yeah, it's a terrible song. Next up on the list, we have a new track from Pitbull featuring Rhea called Ocean to Ocean, and this track comes from the new Aquaman movie soundtrack. I haven't seen the movie itself, so I can't comment on that. But this track is pretty terrible at the end of the day. I'm not a fan of Pitbull by any means. The only reason I even bothered to listen to this track was because I initially heard that he decided to cover Toto's Africa, and that just sounded like such a ridiculous idea that I needed to hear what it sounded like. So you can imagine my confusion when I found this track instead, and it didn't appear to be a cover of Toto's Africa because that wasn't the name of the track. I still listened to the song anyway just to see what people were talking about, and all the puzzle pieces fell into place after giving this track a listen, because while he doesn't cover Toto's Africa here on this song, what he essentially does is he takes many of the aspects of that track, incorporates them into his own, not in the way of a sample or anything. It's like recreated parts of the original song. He incorporates it into his own, and you end up with this monstrosity, basically. The instrumental to this track, as I said before, is kind of like this redone version of the original instrumental, except it's just ever so slightly off that it's really bothersome to someone who enjoys the original track. In the chorus here, it's the same lyrics, it's the same delivery as the original track, however it's performed by the featured artist Rhea here on this track as opposed to just, sampling the original chorus. And the delivery on the hook here just has nowhere near as much passion. It doesn't explode nearly as much as the original chorus on the original version of the song does. And the original hook to Toto's Africa is one of my favorite choruses in any song out there. It's just really explosive, it's really fun, it's incredibly memorable, and overall that track is just a great pop song at the end of the day. But this version here, it has nowhere near as much energy to it, it's nowhere near as memorable or exciting. It just is a major disservice to the original song. As for Pitbull himself and his own contributions to the track, he spits a couple of, generic Pitbull verses. He doesn't say anything really all too interesting. It's just the same old stuff from him pretty much, and it's by no means something that's going to save this song. What's really frustrating about this track is that I just don't get why Africa had to be tied into all of this. The only reason I can think of is because the track is kind of popular right now to some extent, with all the memes surrounding it, and the Weezer cover that came out earlier this year that had a fair amount of popularity surrounding it as well. It's just a pretty popular song right now, I guess you could say, and by sampling it or doing whatever they did with it here on this song, I'm sure Pitbull and whatever people were behind this track knew that it'd get a lot of attention. I mean, heck, that's the only reason I checked out this track. I'm sure there's lots of people out there who are just like me who checked this track out only because they heard it was like a cover or out of morbid curiosity or something like that, and I guess it's going to work to some extent if it managed to work on me. Pitbull's verses here are garbage. The way they incorporate Africa into this song is a massive disrespect to the original track. And at the end of the day, this is just it's a trash song, really. And the fact that it's tied to a massive film is just really surprising as well. Next up on my list, I have the track Ye vs. the People by Kanye West featuring T.I. Now, Kanye's had a pretty eventful year, for better or worse, and this track managed to come out around the time that, the whole Kanye supporting Trump thing came to light, and this track is essentially Kanye's attempt at explaining his reasonings for supporting Trump. And it's not a very good explanation at the end of the day. I don't just dislike this track because I disagree with Kanye's stance here on the track, but really because he doesn't really have a very good argument here on this song. In fact, he really doesn't have any argument here on this track, which is a pretty bad thing if that's really the only reason why this track exists. All I could really get from this track is the reason why he supported Trump was because that would be him doing what he's not supposed to do. It'd be him going against the grain, pretty much. And I can get behind the idea about going against the grain and all that. At times, that's important to do. However, you need an actual reasons outside of that before doing stuff. If you look to history, all the people who went against the grain and made great changes because of that, they didn't just go against the grain to go against the grain. They had other reasons for doing what they did. And Kanye just does not present those reasons here on this track. He essentially is just doing whatever he wants because he just wants to be different from everyone else. And if it came down to something like him doing different things in music or fashion or whatever he wanted to do, that was something along those lines that wasn't going to affect people, really, that would be perfectly fine. But when it comes to things like politics and all this stuff, it affects actual people. So you should probably think through it a bit more and not just do things because it's what you're not supposed to do, because that could have really bad consequences. T.I. on this track attempts to be a counter-argument of sorts to Kanye's claims, but really he just sounds so bored and out of it on this track. It sounds like he's been stuck in this argument with Kanye for hours at this point, and he's just praying to whatever deity he believes in to just strike him down and end his suffering in this everlasting argument with Kanye that he's just never going to win, because Kanye just is going to do whatever the heck he wants and he's just not going to listen to anyone else. And when it comes to Kanye's delivery on this track, it's also just pretty uninteresting at the end of the day. It's not awful or anything, but it's not anything to write home about either. The same goes for the production here too. The instrumental here is acceptable, I guess, but it's nothing super interesting either. Essentially what I'm trying to get at here is that neither the feature or Kanye's delivery or the production really saves the lack of a good message here in this song. And I don't believe that all songs need good messages or things like that, but when the message here is just so clearly misguided, it doesn't sit with me right, really, at the end of the day. And this is definitely going to be one of the bigger blemishes on Kanye's career at the end of the day, given that he really can't go back and undo this song or anything like that. It's forever attached to his career. Moving on to my number 2 pick, we're moving from a track that was pretty ideologically misguided to a track that is really musically misguided, with the track How Long by Tom Morello featuring Steve Aoki and Tim McElrath of the band Rise Against. Now, this track is really, like a lot of the songs from Tom Morello's most recent album, a mess. You know, this is an album that really is favoring from the one song per album rule, because if I didn't have that rule in place, I'd be talking about like every song from that album again here on this list, and that really wouldn't be a whole lot of fun. How Long just really embodies a lot of what went wrong on that last Tom Morello album. It features this mixture of rock and EDM that just does not make for a very good marriage at the end of the day. You have Tom Morello doing some very generic, uninteresting riffs here on this thing. The only positive thing I could really say about them is that they do have that signature Tom Morello sound to them. You could definitely tell that it's him behind it, though I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing with how basic and uninteresting they sound. Like I said in my review of this album, it sounds almost like this is like what he would have done for his guitar work for like Warm Up years ago, like even before Rage Against the Machine. It's that basic and uninteresting. The vocals here on this track sound a little bit too aggressive for the instrumental that it's paired with, and I guess aggressive vocals are something that you may expect coming from the vocalist of Rise Against, but it doesn't pair up very nicely with this instrumental. Tom's guitar parts here are not exactly super aggressive. I wouldn't say they're super laid back either, but they're certainly not aggressive enough to pair up with the vocal delivery here. And the EDM part provided by Steve Aoki, it tries to be somewhat aggressive at times, especially with the drop, but it's not quite aggressive enough, really. This track just comes across as really obnoxious, all things considered, especially during the drop of this track, where the vocals get really distorted and echoey as the drop is going on. It sounds incredibly ridiculous, too. This track is just kind of like Fall Out Boy's Young and Menace, except if Rise Against were to make it, and you also have Tom Morello thrown in there, too, for whatever reason. It's really just a mess of a song at the end of the day. Nothing works here. The guitar parts are just uninteresting and poorly incorporated into the rest of the track. The EDM elements are very basic sounding. They feel more appropriate in a song from like 2012 than they do in a track from 2018. And the vocal performance, it just feels really out of place here as well. Nothing really comes together nicely on this track. So yeah, definitely avoid this one. And with that said, we have reached the number 1 pick on the list, the worst song of 2018, in my opinion. And what song might that be? Well, that number 1 on my list, I have Freaky Friday by Lil Dicky and Chris Brown. Now, this is the track that I probably wouldn't have heard by my own choice. I just happened to hear it around one day, and it happened to be the worst song I would end up hearing this year. So I guess I just have terrible luck in that regard. But this track is just awful on pretty much every front, really. Now, I know some people may defend this track by claiming it's a comedy song, it's a joke song, it's not meant to be taken seriously, But there's a lot of great comedy music out there. In fact, when we get to my best albums and songs of the year list, we're going to be talking about some comedy music there that I think pretty highly of. So I'm by no means against comedy music, and in fact, I think the whole idea of comedic music is actually pretty good at the end of the day. There's some great comedy songs out there that I really enjoy. This isn't one of them, though. This track just is not funny at the end of the day. There's nothing to it that made me laugh or even smile. It's just really unpleasant to listen to. The general plot of this song is that Lil Dicky and Chris Brown switch bodies and hijinks ensue pretty much. From this switching of bodies, you get some of the worst humor in the entire song. It's just stuff that's really juvenile to the point of where even like middle schoolers I don't even think would find funny. For example, on Chris Brown's part of the track, which is actually Lil Dicky in Chris Brown's body in the plot of the song, he's happy because he can now say the N-word, and that he does so several times. I mean, the track is clearly presenting this as a joke, however, it's really not all that funny. But the humor on this track can get even worse than that, believe it or not, because on Chris Brown's part of the track in Lil Dicky's body, he talks about being happy now because he doesn't have to worry about people judging him for his controversial past, which, given the fact that, you know, it's a bit more than a controversial past, but he's done some pretty terrible stuff, and the fact that he hasn't really done anything to make up for it all that much, just makes for a really uncomfortable listen when it comes to this part of the track. I mean, this is clearly supposed to be a joke in the context of the song, but for one thing, it's really not all that funny, and for another thing, the fact that they thought that this was funny is kind of concerning. Because the punchline to this track is pretty much that Chris Brown is an awful person, but the fact that this track is written by Chris Brown and Lil Dicky as well, being self-aware of the fact that Chris Brown is an awful person, just makes for a really strange listen in some regards, because I can't believe they went as far as to actually write this, but is also just really frustrating as well, the fact that they thought that this was funny and something that should be put in a song, especially a joke song. Outside of the lyrics and the attempts at humor that this song makes, a lot of the rest of this track isn't particularly good either. The instrumental is pretty run-of-the-mill and uninteresting. The performances here aren't super good either. Lil Dicky's is pretty uninteresting at the end of the day, and Chris Brown's is slathered in so much auto-tune that it just doesn't sound all too pleasant. This track just has like no redeeming qualities to it. The production isn't good, the performances aren't very good either, the lyrics are garbage, and that's a pretty bad thing for a comedy track, considering that for a comedy song, the lyrics have to be pretty good, and they have to be funny most importantly, in order to make you laugh or at least smile. But the comedy here, or what tries to get passed as comedy, for one thing, isn't really all that funny. It's oftentimes really juvenile and not like in an endearing way or anything like that. Or it's just being really uncomfortable, like with that whole controversial past thing for Chris Brown. It just comes across like the people behind this track who were writing this track, I don't know if it was Chris Brown and Lil Dicky themselves, but whoever was writing the lyrics to this track and who was writing the jokes to this track must just be really tone deaf when it comes to this type of stuff, because this is stuff that really shouldn't be joked about. So at the end of the day, this is a collaborative track that I could have gone this year without hearing for sure. And it's definitely a track that I will never be revisiting again. Just a terrible track in every regard, and definitely one that you should avoid listening to if you haven't heard so already. Trust me, it's not funny, it's not interesting, it's not endearing, it's not even interesting in the slightest sense of the word, and it's certainly not a so bad it's good type of song either. So yeah, just avoid this one if you haven't heard it. And with that said, that concludes my top 10 worst songs of 2018. Thank you for watching this list. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. I do have more year-end countdown lists that should be coming out soon, and if you want to see all the ones I've already put out this year so far, and any ones I've put out in previous years, as well as other lists I've done on this channel, there is a playlist linked in the description down below that you should check out. Comment down below what were some of your worst songs of 2018 personally. I'm sure I haven't heard all of them, and I probably won't seek out listening any of them. Not because I don't like you or anything, I just don't want to do that to myself. But yeah, please leave that stuff in the comment section down below. Thank you guys once again for watching this video, and stay golden.